I'm a doctor.
Back up, sir.
Patient's dying. I need to get in there.
Sir, stay right here.
Move! Emergency surgery!
Hold on.
Step back, doctor.
Let me through. Sir, last one.
Taser ready.
Taser deployed.
Roll him. Cuffing.
Please clear wires out.
Please, patient.
The scene opens already in motion, already unstable. This is not a calm investigation that slowly goes wrong. This is a situation officers arrive at after control has already been lost. Narratives have already fractured, and the emotional temperature of the crowd has reached a point where authority is no longer automatically accepted. It has to be asserted, negotiated, or imposed. From the very beginning, officers are attempting to do something deceptively simple: determine who was involved, who was assaulted, and who needs to stay while that determination is made. But the environment immediately works against them. Multiple witnesses are speaking at once. Descriptions conflict. Key suspects are already leaving. The people most emotionally invested in the fight remain on scene, while the individuals alleged to have thrown the punches are actively slipping away. This imbalance is critical. It sets the tone for everything that follows. Instead of a clear suspect and a clear victim, officers are confronted with overlapping claims of innocence, accusations shouted across a parking lot, and a crowd that refuses to collapse into neat categories. In these moments, policing becomes less about enforcing law and more about managing perception. Who looks like a problem, who sounds like a problem, and who feels controllable in the moment. Early on, officers make a choice that will quietly shape the rest of the encounter. They focus their attention on the loudest, most confrontational individuals still present, rather than immediately pursuing those identified as having fled after committing violence. This is not unusual. It is operationally understandable, but it is also the first step in a chain reaction where convenience begins to outweigh precision. As officers try to separate people physically and verbally, we see the first fault line emerge: detention versus compliance. Several individuals are told to hang tight while officers figure this out. The language is deliberately informal, intentionally non-legal, but to the people being addressed, the meaning is unmistakable. Do not leave. This is where the legal ambiguity begins. Being told to stay put without being told why, without being told for how long, and without being told whether one is free to leave, creates immediate friction. For some people, that friction stays internal. For others, it becomes vocal, confrontational, and defiant. One man in particular repeatedly insists that he has nothing to do with the fight. His insistence is not subtle. He does not quietly wait his turn. He challenges the premise of the investigation itself. From his perspective, he is being detained without cause, while the real offenders escape accountability in real time. From the officer's perspective, the situation is spiraling. Every raised voice threatens to reignite violence. Every refusal to comply threatens to unravel what little control they have established. The investigation has not even begun, yet the environment already feels adversarial. This is the moment where psychology overtakes procedure. Instead of narrowing focus and isolating witnesses one by one, the interaction becomes increasingly performative. Commands are repeated. Voices rise. Officers attempt to assert authority through tone rather than clarity. The man insisting on leaving grows louder, not because he wants a fight, but because volume becomes his only leverage in a situation where he feels unheard. Crucially, officers do not articulate a clear legal threshold for why he must remain. They say they are trying to piece everything together. They say it's hectic. They say they don't know yet. Each of these explanations makes sense emotionally, but none of them resolves the central issue: whether they have reasonable suspicion to detain him specifically. That gap between what officers feel and what the law requires widens with every exchange. As the crowd watches, authority becomes less about lawful justification and more about who will back down first. The man is not calm, he is agitated, defensive, and increasingly hostile in his language. But agitation alone is not a crime. Hostility alone is not obstruction. And yet, these behaviors begin to take on outsized importance because they disrupt the officer's ability to stabilize the scene. Meanwhile, critical investigative opportunities slip away. Witnesses who could clarify who threw the first punch are not immediately isolated. Individuals identified as having fled are not promptly pursued. Instead, energy is poured into controlling the people still present, the ones easiest to command, confront, and eventually restrain. This is how authority subtly shifts from reactive to punitive. When the man asserts constitutional language, mentioning amendments, invoking rights, it does not slow the situation down. It accelerates it. Officers respond not by clarifying legal boundaries, but by reframing his speech as a threat. Statements made in frustration are interpreted as intent. Warnings become ultimatums. At this stage, the encounter stops being about the original assault and starts becoming about compliance itself. The psychology of escalation is now fully engaged. Officers feel challenged publicly. The man feels singled out unjustly. Neither side believes the other is listening. Each statement is filtered through assumption rather than analysis. The language officers use shifts subtly. They begin referencing obstruction, peace and good order, and interfering. These terms are broad, flexible, and, when applied loosely, dangerously subjective. They are often used in chaotic scenes, precisely because they give officers wide discretion. But discretion without restraint invites inconsistency. As tensions rise, officers repeatedly tell the man to relax, even as their own commands grow sharper and more forceful. This contradiction is not lost on him. Being told to calm down while being threatened with arrest feels less like de-escalation and more like provocation. The presence of family members further complicates matters. Protective instincts kick in. Personal boundaries collapse. Officers now have to manage not just one agitated individual, but a cluster of people emotionally invested in his treatment. Every movement becomes suspect. Every question becomes interference. This is where the investigation effectively stalls. Instead of gathering facts, officers begin managing defiance. Instead of identifying assailants, they begin documenting resistance. The original victims fade into the background as the focus shifts toward restoring control through enforcement rather than resolution. The pivotal mistake here is not a single command or a single arrest. It is the accumulation of unresolved ambiguity. The man is told he is not free to leave, yet not clearly told why. He is accused of obstruction, yet not given a concrete obstructive act. He is ordered to comply, yet not offered a path to compliance that preserves his dignity or autonomy. By the time physical contact occurs, the legal justification has become secondary to the emotional momentum of the scene. Officers are no longer deciding whether arrest is necessary. They are deciding whether they can afford not to arrest without losing authority in front of the crowd. Once hands are placed on him, the outcome is effectively sealed. From that moment forward, every movement is interpreted through the lens of resistance. Attempts to speak become yelling. Attempts to reposition become defiance. Attempts to question become interference. The arrest justifies itself retroactively. What makes this moment so critical is that it does not erupt suddenly. It unfolds slowly, predictably, almost mechanically. Each decision builds on the last, narrowing options until force feels inevitable rather than chosen. This is how ordinary chaos becomes extraordinary consequence. The original fight, a moment of ego, alcohol, and impulsive violence, should have been the central focus. Instead, the system gravitates toward the individual who refuses to be passive in the face of perceived injustice. His refusal becomes the problem that must be solved, even as the initial harm goes unresolved. By the end of this first phase, the scene has transformed. Officers are no longer chasing clarity. They are defending authority. The man is no longer asserting innocence. He is reacting to power being exercised against him. Everything that follows, every charge, every escalation, every justification, flows from this unresolved tension. And once that line is crossed, there is no clean way back. By the time the confrontation hardens into physical restraint, the logic of the scene has inverted. The officers are no longer reacting to an unfolding disturbance. They are reacting to a person who refuses to submit to the version of events they have implicitly accepted. The investigation has stopped moving forward, but the enforcement mechanism has not. It continues, propelled by momentum rather than clarity. This is the second phase of escalation, the point where the system begins protecting itself. Once the man is told he is not free to leave, the encounter becomes binary. There are only two acceptable outcomes from the officer's perspective: compliance or custody. There is no longer room for negotiation, explanation, or recalibration. Any attempt by him to assert autonomy, stepping away, questioning orders, raising his voice, is now framed as defiance rather than confusion. What is striking is how quickly the justification for detention shifts. Initially, officers reference the need to figure out what's going on. Then they reference people fighting. Then they reference interference. Each explanation is broader than the last, less tethered to specific conduct. This widening scope allows officers to continue holding him without ever resolving whether he was actually involved in the original assault. This is not accidental. Broad language is a pressure valve in chaotic scenes. It allows officers to act decisively without committing to a precise narrative. But that same flexibility erodes accountability. When everything becomes potentially obstructive, nothing has to be proven in the moment. The man senses this shift immediately. His frustration is no longer about the bar fight. It is about the rules changing mid-conversation. He is arguing not with what officers are saying, but with what they are doing, restricting his movement, dismissing his explanations, escalating tone without articulating cause. His behavior becomes more erratic, more confrontational. From the outside, it looks like loss of control. From the inside, it is a last attempt to reclaim agency in a process that feels predetermined. This is where the psychology of authority becomes critical. Officers are trained to recognize resistance, but not always to distinguish between resistance to unlawful conduct and resistance to lawful orders. In this moment, that distinction collapses. The louder he becomes, the more certain Officers feel that they must be right to restrain him. Meanwhile, the original suspects, the men alleged to have thrown punches, remain secondary concerns. They are discussed in fragments, referenced in passing but never prioritized. The imbalance deepens. The person least connected to the original violence becomes the focal point of enforcement, while those most connected drift further out of reach. The presence of cameras complicates this further. Everyone knows the interaction is being recorded. Officers mention it. The man mentions it, his family mentions it. Instead of encouraging restraint, the cameras seem to harden positions. Each side performs for the record, believing the footage will ultimately vindicate them. But body cameras do not capture intent. They capture reactions. When physical restraint begins, it is framed as necessary, even inevitable. The commands become sharper. The tolerance for delay disappears. The moment his body is forced downward, the narrative locks into place. He is now resisting, regardless of whether his movements are reflexive, defensive, or simply confused. This is the trap of escalation. Once force is used, it creates its own justification. Every subsequent movement can be cited as evidence that the force was necessary. The threshold for stopping shrinks as the cost of backing down grows. What follows is not control, but containment. Officers are no longer trying to resolve the incident. They are trying to end it. The priority becomes removing him from the environment, from the crowd, from the argument. Arrest becomes a tool for restoring order, not enforcing justice. This is a subtle but profound shift in purpose. The man's language deteriorates further. Insults fly, accusations escalate. These statements are later cited as evidence of disorderly conduct, peace violations, and obstruction. But they occur after authority has already been forcibly asserted. Cause and effect blur. His family's attempts to intervene only reinforce officers' perception that the situation is spiraling. What might have been advocacy is now interference. What might have been concern is now disruption. The line between involvement and obstruction is redrawn again, always in the direction that favors control. At no point does the scene truly de-escalate. It only transitions from standing confrontation to ground restraint, from ground restraint to handcuffs, from handcuffs to patrol car. Each step feels procedural, but none of them resolves the underlying dispute about why this is happening in the first place. And then comes the paperwork logic. Once charges are mentioned, obstruction, disorderly conduct, peace and good order, the narrative solidifies. These are not charges that require a victim statement or physical evidence. They rely heavily on officer perception. They are resilient charges. They survive scrutiny because they are inherently subjective. This is where institutional incentives quietly assert themselves. An unresolved, chaotic scene looks like failure. An arrest looks like resolution. Even if the arrest does not address the original harm, it creates an endpoint the system can process. The man's repeated demand, "What am I being arrested for?" is not answered with specificity. Instead, it is met with authority. He is told what he is charged with, not what he did. The distinction matters. One explains conduct. The other asserts power. At this stage, the emotional roles are fixed. Officers see a non-compliant subject who escalated the situation through his own behavior. The man sees officers who ignored the real offenders and targeted him because he refused to submit quietly. Both narratives are internally coherent. Neither fully engages with the other. This is the danger of bodycam footage. Viewers often believe it reveals truth, when it actually reveals perspective. What we see here is not a single bad decision, but a cascade of ordinary decisions made under stress, each narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes. As the man is placed in the vehicle, the language shifts again. The intensity drops. Apologies surface. Officers explain that this wasn't the goal. These statements are sincere, but they are also retrospective. They acknowledge harm only after it has already been done. The system moves on. Officers return to investigating the original fight. Witnesses are interviewed. Surveillance footage is referenced. Slowly, the truth of the initial assault emerges, confirming that others were, in fact, responsible for the punches. But this clarity comes too late for the man already in custody. His arrest is no longer contingent on the facts of the fight. It stands on its own, insulated by secondary charges and procedural momentum. Even if officers now understand he was not the instigator, the machine cannot easily reverse itself. The cost of undoing the arrest is higher than the cost of letting it stand. This is how misalignment becomes injustice. The law is designed to be precise, but its application often isn't. In volatile environments, precision is sacrificed for speed. Nuance is sacrificed for authority. Individuals who do not intuitively perform compliance become liabilities rather than participants. The man's greatest mistake was not his language or his tone. It was his refusal to disappear quietly while the system resolved itself around him. In many encounters, silence is rewarded more than innocence. By the end of this phase, the story has split in two. One track continues toward identifying the actual assailants. The other track accelerates toward processing an arrest that no longer depends on that outcome. Both tracks are real. Both will appear in reports, but only one will shape the man's immediate future. And once the door of the patrol car closes, the opportunity for de-escalation disappears entirely. By the time the investigation finally regains clarity, the damage has already been done. The scene has quieted, not because justice has been served, but because the most disruptive presence has been removed. This is the final stage of the encounter, not escalation, but rationalization. Once the man is secured in the vehicle, the tone of the officers shifts noticeably. The urgency drains out of their voices. The language becomes explanatory instead of commanding. This tonal change is revealing. It suggests that the conflict was never truly about danger, but about manageability. With him gone, the scene is suddenly workable. Officers now begin doing what they were initially dispatched to do: gather statements, compare accounts, and reconstruct the sequence of events inside and outside the bar. Witnesses are separated. Security staff provides context. Surveillance footage is referenced. Slowly, the picture sharpens, and the picture contradicts the trajectory that led to the arrest. The assault was real. The punches were real. And the individuals responsible were not the man in custody. They were people who left early, who blended into the night while attention was elsewhere. The system now recognizes this, but recognition does not equal remedy. This is the institutional paradox at the heart of the case. The truth emerges only after enforcement has already concluded. But enforcement does not rewind when truth catches up. It moves forward, processing what it has, not what it should have had. As officers acknowledged to others on scene that the man was trying to break things up, that he was not the aggressor, that the situation spiraled faster than intended, we see something rare: remorse without repair. Apologies are offered, but they carry no procedural weight. They do not undo charges. They do not restore agency. They simply acknowledge that the outcome diverged from the ideal. This is where the system's rigidity becomes most visible. The charges applied, obstruction, disorderly conduct, peace, and good order, are not designed to be revisited once initiated. They are administrative anchors. They stabilize chaos by converting it into paperwork. Whether or not they align with the original harm becomes secondary. The man, now restrained, continues to assert his innocence, but his voice carries less force. His words are filtered through the assumption of guilt that arrest creates. Even reasonable statements are heard as excuses. Even accurate observations are dismissed as rationalizations. Meanwhile, officers are now juggling two parallel narratives. One is the factual reconstruction of the assault. The other is the procedural justification for the arrest. These narratives do not intersect cleanly, so they are kept separate. This separation allows the system to function without confronting its own contradictions. When surveillance footage later confirms the identity of the assailants, it validates what some witnesses had been saying all along. It confirms that the initial violence came from elsewhere, that the man in custody was not the cause of the fight's origin. But confirmation does not translate into release. Instead, the narrative shifts again. Now the arrest is framed not as a response to the assault, but as a response to the man's behavior afterward. His words, his refusal to comply, his failure to de-escalate in a situation that demanded submission. This reframing is legally permissible, but ethically fraught. It means that a person can be arrested not for what they did, but for how they reacted to being wrongly treated. It means that emotional responses to perceived injustice can become their own justification for punishment. This is not an anomaly, it is a pattern. In volatile public encounters, especially those involving alcohol, crowds, and conflicting accounts, law enforcement often prioritizes immediate order over eventual accuracy. The fastest way to end chaos is to remove the person least willing to accept ambiguity. The loudest voice becomes the problem to be solved. From a tactical standpoint, this works. From a justice standpoint, it erodes trust. The man's repeated references to race, bias, and unequal treatment are uncomfortable, but they do not arise in a vacuum. They emerge from a lived experience where authority feels asymmetrical, where explanations are demanded from civilians but not offered by officers, where compliance is mandatory but accountability feels optional. Whether or not bias influenced individual decisions in this case is ultimately less important than how the system responded to the perception of bias. At no point is that concern meaningfully addressed. It is dismissed as noise, further reinforcing the man's belief that he is being targeted rather than heard. This dismissal becomes self-fulfilling. The more he insists on being wronged, the more officers view him as uncooperative. The more uncooperative he appears, the more justified enforcement feels. The cycle closes in on itself. Later, when officers express regret, saying this wasn't the goal, it reveals a disconnect between intention and outcome. No one set out to arrest the wrong person. No one arrived intending to escalate. And yet intent does not negate impact. What failed here was not morality, but structure. There was no clear boundary between detention and conversation. No early articulation of legal status. No decisive pursuit of the identified assailants while the opportunity still existed. Each small omission compounded until force became the default solution. The final irony is that the system eventually does what it should have done first. It identifies the real offenders. It documents the assault. It acknowledges the chaos. But it does so after collateral damage has already occurred. The man leaves, not vindicated but burdened, by charges, by humiliation, by a reinforced distrust of the institutions meant to protect him. Even if some charges are later reduced or dismissed, the experience itself cannot be undone. The memory of being restrained, dismissed, and punished for refusing to be silent will outlast any legal resolution. This is how accountability fails quietly. Not through malice, but through momentum. Not through corruption, but through convenience. Not through a single bad actor, but through a system that rewards control more than correction. In the end, the footage does not show heroes or villains. It shows pressure. It shows how authority behaves when clarity is delayed and patience is exhausted. It shows how quickly the focus can shift from justice to compliance, from investigation to enforcement. And it shows something more troubling, that once the system decides who the problem is, facts become optional. The bar fight was a spark. The arrest was the fire. And the space between them, the space where better decisions could have been made, is where the real story lives. This is not just a case about a fight gone wrong. It is a case about how easily power fills a vacuum, how quickly rights become obstacles, and how ordinary chaos can produce extraordinary consequences when restraint gives way to control. By the time the night ends, the scene is calm, reports are written, charges are filed. Officers move on to the next call, but the imbalance remains. Because the real question this footage leaves behind is not who was arrested, but who was heard.